You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Fantasies about death are at the heart of all religious systems. They are the way you avoid the absolute truth of Hevel. You say to yourself, perhaps it's true that this world is marked by impermanence, but the next is surely eternal. But can you really know this? Of course not. And because you know you can't know, doubt creeps in and robs you of even this false security. Qoheleth urges you to live without knowing. His is the wisdom of insecurity. There is little you can know in this world, and nothing you can know of any world to come. Take refuge in what can be known, and leave the rest alone. What can be known? That all life is emptying, and that to live well in an emptying world means to eat simply, drink moderately, work constructively, and befriend lovingly. These thought-provoking words from Rabbi Rami Shapiro well summarize what we have talked about so far in our Ecclesiastes study, and sum up well what we are going to cover today, as chapter 6 is really just a continuation of where we were last week in chapter 5. And Qoheleth now takes those themes from chapter 5 and, like he has with the other topics so far, runs them out to their logical conclusions. He is trying to get us to follow out our beliefs to their very ends, and so that we can see the absurdity and the contradictions that are often in our belief systems. Hold on tight, because Qoheleth is going to question the value of traditional wisdom we find in other parts of the Bible and just in the culture at large, and he's going to question the value of the things we hold to most dearly in life. This is Ecclesiastes chapter 6, Uncut and Unfiltered. Brown in the interpretation commentary has summarized chapter 6 saying this: as chapter 5 concludes with the gift of enjoyment, so chapter 6 treats the obsession that kills enjoyment. The following collection of sayings illustrates joy's polar opposite, desire. End quote. So let's look at the first few verses here. There is an evil which I have seen under the sun, and it is common among men. A man to whom God has given riches, wealth, and honor, so that he wants or desires nothing for his soul, of everything he desires, yet God doesn't give him power to eat of it, but a stranger eats it. This is Hevel, and it is an evil disease. All right, let's stop there for a second. Quick reminder here that when we are talking about Hevel, what a lot of translations will have as vanity or something along those lines, is not actually talking about meaninglessness or worthlessness that a lot of preachers will try to imply. It's talking more about this baffling enigma that he sees in life, this glitch in the matrix, this hole in the logic. He is putting his observations of life up against the traditional established wisdom of the world and saying, you have all these black and white rules and suggestions of how life is supposed to go. But here's the gray, here is the reality. And he calls this an evil. Now, how you interpret these verses is kind of going to depend on how you define that word evil, because it can mean evil in a moral sense. It can also just be something bad that happens. In a biblical sense, if I had to tell a friend that a loved one had passed away, I would be delivering evil news, bad news. It's not necessarily anything morally wrong about that person dying or about my having to tell my friend about that, but there's a sense in which, because that's negative, because that's regarding death, it is actually linked to evil and our failure in the garden and the ways that the world has been messed up, as described in Genesis 1 through 6, or really 1 through 11, when you have both the failure, well, all three, the failure in the garden and the incident in Genesis 6 with the sons of God, and then again at the Tower of Babylon. There's really three failure narratives there in those first 11 chapters. So in the biblical worldview, bad things that happen are in a sense tied with evil, but it doesn't necessarily have to have that moral element. Now, I've argued as we have gone through this that I think we should keep the moral element in here. I actually like the translation of evil because I think Qoheleth is trying to challenge our notions of God and suggesting that if we live in this good world that God has created and if we serve a good God, it should ruffle our feathers that there is so much evil that happens in the world. He is pointing out, I don't want to say a contradiction in our belief system, but something that should rub us the wrong way, something that should get us thinking about the way that the world works and what our responsibility for that is. Now, when he says that this is an evil which I have seen under the sun, remember that is his way of saying just in the totality of life. We mentioned quite a while ago, back in I think our very first episode for the series, that does not mean this side of eternity. A lot of preachers take that phrase, under the sun, and they think it means that he is completely removing God from the picture, he's completely removing an afterlife from the picture. But as we displayed from other ancient texts, particularly the Epic of Gilgamesh, that phrase, under the sun, just means the totality of existence. There's actually a line from Gilgamesh that says, only the gods live forever under the sun. So he's not excluding God from the picture. That's actually the problem. He's including God in the picture and saying, stuff is still messed up. It's not this happy-go-lucky, joy-filled, candy, sweet portrayal that so many Christians try to put forward of like, oh, I have Jesus, so everything's all right. He's saying you can have God and still have all this messed up stuff. And he says that this thing that I have seen is, and the phrase is, verba hi al ha'adam. And it can mean common among humanity, like the King James has, or it can also mean weighing heavily on humanity. So that's two different ways of looking at this. He could be saying this is an evil that I've seen and it's everywhere I look, or he could be saying this is a really weighty matter that affects everybody. So either way, it could work. Verse 2, he says what this problem is, and it's that God can give riches, wealth, honor, basically everything that you could possibly want in life to someone, but then that person doesn't actually get to enjoy it. The way he puts it is, God does not give him the power to eat thereof. I think it's so interesting that he uses the word eat there, because notice what he says God gives him: riches, wealth, and honor. He doesn't say God gives him a lot of food. He says riches, wealth, honor, and whatever his soul desires. And yet he says that he doesn't have the power to eat from it. Now, you don't eat riches. Obviously, you can use wealth to buy food. But there's been this focus throughout the book, and especially we noticed it last week, where he is describing the good life in terms of being able to enjoy good food. Now, I am very much a foodie. I am someone who loves finding new places to eat and little hole in the wall spots, mom and pop places. Where we live here in New Jersey, there are 1,000 incredible food places. Don't listen to anyone from New York. We are in the pizza capital of the world right here. This is the best area for American pizza. I would say change my mind, but you cannot change my mind on that. We have cheesesteaks from Philly in this area too, so we have everything you could possibly want. And I love that. That is in so many ways a source of happiness for me. Like, one of my favorite things is to go out with my wife or a couple of friends and just enjoy some good food or drinks. And that, I think Qoheleth would agree with. I think he'd actually be someone I'd really like to hang out with for some food sometimes, because he understands that this is an example of the good life, is when you can just enjoy a good time with some friends and family. And that's really how he defines the good life. It's such a simplistic thing, and it really flies in the face of what we search for. We search for some deep meaning, and he says, here's the good life: eat good food, drink good drinks, hang out with friends and family, and try to work a job that you don't absolutely hate. That's his idea of a good life. And I think it even ties into other themes in the Bible of eating being a communal activity, and possibly also going back to Eden and the fruit that they ate there, and then how that's even kind of turned on its head, where you get this eating language throughout the Bible sometimes. in places you might not expect it. So I think that's what's going on here with this. When he said God has not given him the power to eat thereof, he's saying that he doesn't have the ability to enjoy it. Now, that could mean a couple of different things. That could mean that maybe he dies early. This would be like the self-made millionaire who works his entire life for his fortune, but then ends up dying young. Maybe in some tragedy, or perhaps as the result of excessive drinking or drugs or something like that, where that lifestyle has driven him to make choices where he can't actually even enjoy the wealth that he has obtained. I think it could also be talking about somebody who just is so focused on obtaining more that he doesn't enjoy it. So this could be someone who lives a full life, but is constantly driving to get more and misses out on what he has. And that's the one that really hits me, because that's where I find myself so often. I live in America, and while I am by no means independently wealthy and, able to retire by 30, we're decently well off, certainly better than the majority of the world. And I mean, heck, if you have a phone to listen to this podcast right now, you're better off than most of the world too. Even the poorest person in America is often richer than a lot of the world. And yet we still just drive and drive and drive and try to obtain more. We have this desire that prevents us from actually enjoying what is right in front of us. And we work so hard, whether that's at actual work or at something else, whether that be a hobby or heck, it can be a ministry, it can be church related stuff, that we actually miss out on the important things right in front of us now. No one gets to their deathbed and says, man, I wish I had worked harder in life. Now, they often say, I wish I'd spent more time with family. I wish I had prioritized this instead of that. That's, I think, what he's talking about here, is that sometimes we can become so consumed with consuming, with getting the latest thing, with getting more things, with checking off our to-do list, with checking off our bucket list, with hitting these different milestones in our life, with getting married, with getting the promotion, with getting a better house, or whatever it is, that we think those things will make us happy when we get there. And Qoheleth is saying you're actually missing out on the potential for happiness right now. And he says that if you don't enjoy it now, somebody else will. You will have spent all of this time and energy trying to get what you wanted, and you'll have what you wanted, but you won't be able to enjoy it. Somebody else will take the fruit of that. And he calls this person a stranger. That's a very generic word, but in the interpretation commentary, Brown compares the stranger here to the archetypal nemesis of wisdom in Proverbs, which is the strange woman. Now, that's at least how some of the older translations have it. There are several passages in Proverbs that talk about this quote-unquote strange woman, and it doesn't mean a weird person. It's actually talking about a foreigner, somebody who wasn't part of Israel. And in Proverbs, that's usually used to describe someone in a promiscuous sense, saying basically a seductress. And I realize that can be a little bit of a misogynistic portrayal, and there is all kinds of stuff that we can get into there with the portrayal of women in Proverbs. And we actually kind of will next week, and this is why I thought it was important to bring this up here, because this might seem like a tenuous connection at first. You might be going, really? You're connecting the stranger here with the strange woman from Proverbs? Like, what are you doing? Well, next week when we get into chapter 7, there are going to be a ridiculous amount of correlations to Proverbs, and specifically this idea of a foreign seductress who is trying to take you away from the path of life. So I like that Brown brought this up here. I think he's getting onto something, and he's found a little narrative thread that's beginning. We don't have to make too much out of it, but he is connecting this stranger, this foreigner, this person who has nothing to do with you or what you have achieved in life, but he's the one who gets to enjoy it. And if I can spiritualize for a minute and just take it in a slightly different direction, in a way, we are all the stranger to someone else's work. We all live on the shoulders and backs of those who have gone before us, and the next generation will do the same to us. We are little more than stepping stones for the next generation. So if life will soon cease being for us and will begin to be about them, what can we do in order to help make their way easier? Maybe we should stop focusing on the people who come after us as the strangers who benefit off of us, and maybe we should realize that we get to set them up to make a better tomorrow than we got to have today. Especially here in America, we sacrifice the world of our grandchildren for the enjoyment of our generation. And that is not sustainable. There are only so many resources that we have here in the world that we can use up before we start to screw over the generations that come after us. And I don't think that's wise stewardship. If we go back just to Genesis, God gave us this world not to use and abuse, but to steward and to make better for each successive generation. And I think if we don't, that lends into what Qoheleth here calls this evil disease. And the word disease, that can be a sickness. It can also be suffering. And I like how Shapiro addresses this. He says, the disease Qoheleth warns you about is the incapacity for joy. If you cannot enjoy what you have, having it means nothing. Joy arises from simplicity. Eating simply, drinking moderately, working constructively, loving deeply. If this foundation is laid, having more or less will not distress you. But if this foundation is lacking, if you do not know joy at all, or worse, you are so driven by the disease of greed and envy that you are never capable of the sense of satisfaction and gratitude that joy requires, then your life is nothing but an exercise in futility. End quote. I want to pause on that and just give us a moment to reflect. Do you know joy? I don't mean the in right, out right, up right, down right, happy all the time cheesiness that a lot of Christians often portray, but actual happiness. Now, as Qoheleth has mentioned throughout the rest of the book so far, happiness isn't a continuous state of being. I'm not talking about constantly having a smile on your face and never being sad or depressed. It passes just like everything else, and just like every other emotion. You'll have times when you're happy, times when you're sad, times when you're angry, but have you felt happiness in a while? When's the last time you did? What's the last thing that happened in your life that just made you stop for a second and realize how happy you were? Now, what can you do to engender more opportunities like that? Sometimes happy happens, and then sometimes we have to make happy happen. We have to create situations where it is more likely to come about. If the last time you were really happy was hanging out with your kids, just playing a game with them or something like that, well, can you schedule another time to do that soon? Or maybe you were talking to a loved one on the phone. When's the next time you can give them a call? For me, I realized not that long ago, my wife and I were just sitting down watching a movie together, and I just, for whatever reason, in that moment, caught how much I was smiling and just enjoying relaxing and watching a movie. And it's not even like it was the greatest movie we'd ever seen, it was just the reality of being there together and relaxing with a form of entertainment that we both really enjoy. So recently, I've actually been trying to make that happen more. There's been more times we've just put everything else aside and, maybe went for a little bit of a walk together and then just sat down and enjoyed a movie. Whatever it is that makes you happy, that brings some sense of satisfaction into your life, that doesn't always happen on its own. Sometimes it does, and then sometimes we need to schedule it in. So I would challenge you this week, schedule in some time for something you enjoy. And simply for the fact that you enjoy it. It does not have to be any more productive than that. And it can be whatever you like, whether that's watching a movie, reading a book, playing a game, going on a hike, playing a sport, going out to a restaurant, or whatever it might be. Just schedule it just for the sake of that. Don't spend time on your phone while you're there. And, as much as you can, don't try to be watching the clock the whole time. Just go. Do that thing and try to consciously see how you feel before, during, and after it. Do you find yourself more at peace with yourself and others, and maybe even life in general, when you have taken those times? I know sometimes, especially being here on the East Coast, we live a very fast-paced, busy life. Heck, I talk really fast. I have to slow my voice down when I do this podcast, like noticeably. I have to try to talk more slowly because I go a mile a minute. And I realize that if you're not from the little radius around Philadelphia, you don't understand what I'm saying at my normal speed. But sometimes, because we are so busy, we think that we can't afford to take the time to enjoy the little things in life. I would say you can't afford not to, because we don't know how much of this life we have. You are not guaranteed retirement. You are not guaranteed this upcoming weekend to do something. I'm not saying, be lazy and never do anything. Obviously, we have to work. And Qoheleth works that into his thesis here. Try not to hate your work is part of his key for a good life. But we can take that and work around it as much as possible to fit in some purposeful time just to enjoy the life that we have. Here's where we start getting really controversial with Qoheleth. Verse 3, he says, "If a man begets or fathers 100 children, and lives many years, so that the days of his years be many, and his soul be not filled with good, and also he have no burial, I say that an untimely birth is better than he, because he comes in with vanity," or that's that word hevel, "and departs in darkness, and his name will be covered in darkness. Indeed, he has not seen the sun, nor known anything. This has more rest than the other. Indeed, though he live 1,000 years twice over, yet has he not seen good. Don't all go to one place? All the labor of humanity is for his mouth, and yet the appetite is not filled. For what does the wise have more than the fool? What does the poor have more than knowing to walk before the living? Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of desire. This is also hevel and ruach ruin, vexation of spirit, chasing the wind." Now, we'll pause there and get the last few verses at the end. Let's get back to verse 3 and unpack some of the difficulty going on here, because this is a very sensitive passage, and I want to give a little bit of a content warning here that his whole discussion is talking about miscarriage, and so we are going to get into a little bit of miscarriage and also suicide and value of life and all that here in the next several minutes. So if that's something that you would prefer to skip, we will have the time signatures in the notes on our website when this episode comes out. All right, moving forward. He's talking about this man now who has 100 children. Now, obviously, this is a hypothetical. That's probably not going to happen unless there are many, many wives involved. But this is intentional hyperbole because of the value that the ancient Near Eastern societies placed on having many children. You have to remember that in the ancient world, you would have to have 5 kids just for 3 to survive into adulthood. You often lost children, and sometimes even the mother, in pregnancy and childbirth, and then sometimes they didn't even make it past the first couple years of life. So once you can make it past those first couple years, you were usually good for a while, but it was common to lose children a lot more than it is today. It's really only been in the last 100-ish years that the death rate in childbirth has really plummeted, thanks to modern medicine. So you have to consider that. You also have to consider that a lot of these families were poor. And so you needed more work. Let's say you're a farmer, you need more hired help in the fields. So how do you get that? Well, you can't hire people to work for you. So let's pop out some more kids, and in 5 to 10 years, they're able to help in the farm. And then there's also the idea of bringing wealth and honor to the family name. The more kids you have, the more you are increasing your chances that they're going to be able to increase the glory of your family. And putting it that way sounds a little weird to us today, but this was a heavy emphasis in the ancient Near East, and even in some Eastern cultures today, where it's not as individualistic, it's more of a collectivist culture. There's a lot of pressure put on the family as a unit, and the name, the reputation that that family has, and how much wealth and power and prestige and influence and honor that the more kids you have, the more you're able to bring into the family. But there's also a gamble with that in two ways. One, you're taking a 50-50 shot with the sex of the baby, because if it was a girl in that sort of culture, they would consider her honestly almost like property of the father that basically then transfers hands to somebody else's family. So you could potentially end up losing some of your power in your family if it was a girl. And then you could also take away from that power and influence and honor of the family if the kid was dishonorable. So it's a gamble. The more kids you have, the more chance you have for them to bring honor to the family, but the more chance you also have for them to bring dishonor to the family. So you kind of factor all this stuff in together, and that's why there's such an emphasis on having more children. And then there was also the idea of it being a sign of the patriarch's vitality and virality to be able to father so many kids. Again, very different than how we view it today, but this is the hyperbole that Qoheleth is working with here. He's assuming that you consider the person with the most kids to basically be the most blessed. That's another aspect, is they would bring God into this, and they would say, oh, the more kids a person has, that's obviously God's blessing. So if they have fewer kids, well, that must be because God didn't bless them as much as somebody else. Heck, I think I still know some Christians who act that way today, but that's a whole other conversation for another time. Right now, we just have to realize that this is the hyperbole he's working with to say, like, the most blessed person in your imagination for an ancient Near Eastern person. They have 100 kids. They live many years. And in fact, just a little bit later on, verse 6, he says, if he lives 1,000 years twice over, so if he lives to be 2,000, but going back to verse 3, his soul be not filled with good, and also that he have no burial, I say that an untimely birth is better than he. First, let's deal with that phrase, his soul be not filled with good. Going back to that eating language again, it's literally his soul be not satisfied, like in the sense of, say, Thanksgiving meal, some big buffet meal where you are just fully satisfied, you've loosened up the belt buckle, and there is not a single bite more that you can take. That's the idea of that word there. Like, his soul is overflowing, bursting with good. If that's not the case, so just consider this again from an ancient perspective. You would think a person who has 100 kids is obviously the most blessed of God. He's obviously the happiest you can possibly be. He's obviously the most filled up with good in his life. And yet Qoheleth is saying, well, maybe that's not the case. It's possible that you could have all of that and not be satisfied with good. Qoheleth is challenging the unquestionable value of having a lot of kids, which would be kind of unheard of in that sort of culture. Now, he certainly wasn't alone in this. There are other people, and we'll get into this in a minute, that question the value of having so many children, but it was just kind of prevailing wisdom at that time. Have a bunch of kids because it's going to make your life better. And he's saying, is it? I mean, heck, this even comes into a conversation today. There's someone I know who recently wrote a paper advocating for Christians having lots of children. And while I have no problem if that's what you personally want to do in your life, I do have a problem when we bring the Bible into it and try to make this a morality thing, that you have to have a lot of kids in order to be pleasing to God, or that this is a moral responsibility, or that this is what is best for everyone. I don't think that's the case. And again, that's another conversation for another time to get more into detail on, and I think we probably will in the future. But I think that even here we find this divergent voice in Qoheleth who's saying, maybe this isn't the automatic blessing that you think it is. Maybe there's a downside to having a lot of kids as well. Maybe there's a downside to having kids at all. Maybe it doesn't automatically equal multiplied blessing. Now notice he's not saying don't have children. And he's not saying kids are a curse instead of a blessing. He's just questioning the prevailing wisdom that says this is a black and white, it's automatically a great thing. And he's saying, is it? Is it that good? Is it that great? Is it that ideal? He's being very much a voice of realism amongst all the idealism in a lot of the rest of the Bible. That's something that I wish people knew more of, is that the Bible was written in a very idealized way. In other words, it's saying this is the ideal. This is in basically a non fallen world, if we can put it that way. This is the way that we should be acting. But we live in a fallen world. And that's why you get stuff like Proverbs, where it has these black and whites that seem like they should work, and then we don't always find them working. And Qoheleth is the one who's saying we need to be more realist than we need to be idealist. We need to be looking at what is the reality instead of just what is the ideals, because only by working through what is real can we perhaps bring about some of what is ideal. Let's look at this next phrase that he has here where he says, this man has no burial. Now, that brings up a question here of why? Why does he not have a burial? And he doesn't say. And there's 1,000 different ways that commentators go with this. Did his children forsake him? Like he didn't have any family to bury him when he died? And if that's the case, well, why did that happen? Obviously, that would be a massive disgrace. I mean, even today, that's really sad when no one shows up to a funeral or there's no family around. But, especially in an ancient Near Eastern context where there is so much focus on family.
But what's real is family. Your family.
In that sort of collectivist culture, you would have to ask what happened that he did not have a single one of these 100 children think that he deserved the basic decency of a burial. Was he actually a bad person? Or did he die in a manner that prevented his body from being buried? Did he die at sea and drowned and his body wasn't able to be recovered? Did he die in war and his body couldn't be recovered? Was he burned? We're not given any of this information. But here's where Qoheleth really presses his illustration and makes it honestly extremely shocking, as he says that an untimely birth, now that's the word for a miscarriage. He's saying a miscarriage is better than this person. And some people have even tried to connect the no burial idea to the miscarriage. Some have suggested that maybe in certain ancient cultures, stillborn children may not have actually been given a proper burial. Others think that maybe this no burial idea is actually not an insult, but just means that he never died, so he didn't need a burial because, he lived 2,000 years and maybe he just kept living beyond that. Whatever the means, the real shock factor here is that he says, if you did not enjoy the good life that you had, it would have been better to have been born stillborn. Shapiro summarizes this well. He says, and then there are those who live long lives, though the number of years are not important, and have hundreds of children. Yet if they too are incapable of finding contentment in the goodness life brings, I say the stillborn left unburied is yet better off. I want to acknowledge this is a very difficult text. And I don't think it's something that we should just gloss over because, hey, it's in the Bible and so it's okay. No, I have known friends who have had miscarriages and who have had stillborn children, and it hurts. There is all kinds of pain that goes with that. And honestly, if you haven't been through it, you don't understand. And that's not something I have experienced. So I put myself in that category to acknowledge I don't fully understand. I try to as best I can, and I've tried to listen to the stories of friends who have been through that. But that's just one of those topics where the standard platitudes and the niceties that we say just kind of fall short. And it's just like, what do you say at that point? And yet Qoheleth is using this shocking image to say it would be better never to have lived at all, to be born not breathing, than to live for 2,000 years, have hundreds of kids, and not enjoy your life. Now, this isn't the first time he's used this kind of language either. You can go back to our episode on chapter 4, where we talk a little bit about his relationship with antinatalism and how that's actually a very ancient philosophy as well, and even finds some precedent in biblical characters like Job and Jeremiah, who also praise the unborn and those who are stillborn rather than those who live and have suffering in life. But I just want to pause for a minute here and ask you, how does this make you feel? especially if you are someone who has experienced a miscarriage or knows someone who has. Do you find this kind of language off-putting? Does it distract from his message of what he is trying to say here? Or do you find that it brings more validity to what he's saying? I think that we have to realize that these passages don't necessarily have to be taken at immediate face value. We don't have to look at this and say, oh, you have somebody who's miserable in life. It would have been better if they were never born. Like, there it is in the Bible. Now, I think this could be hyperbole, very much in the sense of how Jesus frequently employed hyperbole. You know, he said, if your hand offends you, cut it off. If your eye offends you, pluck it out. There are a lot of people in the world who do offensive things but aren't walking around with one hand and one eye. Even that's a whole other conversation of, does that affect people who are actually blind in one eye or who have actually lost a hand? Like, you know, we have this imagery that we use as able-bodied people, and sometimes we don't think from the other side of how using that as a negative illustration could potentially feel invalidating to somebody who is in that situation by no fault of their own. That's another conversation for another day, but I do think it's worth bringing up here. And so as we deal with these difficult passages and kind of let them marinate in our minds, we have to realize that there is room for the Bible to use poetic language. I mean, this is grouped in the poetic books of our English Bibles most of the times. But even that does not take away from the value of what he is saying here. I think he's making a very powerful statement that is actually useful for us today. And to illustrate that, I want to give a rather lengthy quotation here from T.F. Long, who had a journal article called Ecclesiastes in Context, Reclaiming Qoheleth's Canonical Authority. So it is a little long, but I'd encourage you to listen to this part here and stay with me on this, because I think he really has some interesting thoughts as he compares what Qoheleth said here with the philosophy, rather controversial existentialist Albert Camus. And if you are just listening to this, Camus is spelled Camus. So if you see that in the notes, it's not Camus or Camus, it's Camus. So here's what Long says about this. To better appreciate the relevance of the dialogue of pessimism for today. Now, what he's talking about with the dialogue of pessimism there, something we get into more on our first episode in chapter 3. I think it was on like the first 8 verses of the chapter, something like that. We explain some of the context there and how the dialogue of pessimism was an ancient Mesopotamian work that talks about a master and his slaves dialogue back and forth, and it fits in pretty well with some of what Qoheleth has in chapter 3. So if you haven't listened to that episode, I'd encourage you to go back there and you can get some of the context there. So back to Long now. To better appreciate the relevance of the dialogue of pessimism for today and how this relates to the canonicity of Qoheleth's speech in Ecclesiastes, we should now compare and contrast it with its modern counterpart, The Myth of Sisyphus by Nobel Prize-winning existentialist Albert Camus. Like the dialogue, Camus' essay addresses the issue of suicide and the meaning of life. Unlike the dialogue, divine transcendence is taken out of the picture. In this essay, the certainty of our death becomes part of a larger theme. Life has no meaning. This is how Camus begins his essay. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. I therefore conclude that the meaning of life is the most urgent of questions. He claims that life is absurd because it is meaningless, and goes so far as to affirm that for all healthy men having thought of their own suicide, it can be seen that there is a direct connection between this feeling of absurdity and the longing for death. However, Camus clarifies, one kills oneself because life is not worth living. That is certainly a truth. But does that insult to existence, suicide, come from the fact that it has no meaning? Does its absurdity require one to escape it through hope or suicide? So those are the two options he sees as escapes. You can either escape absurdity through hope or through suicide. Now, Long continues. To appreciate Camus' answer to this question, we first take a closer look at why he says life is absurd. The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. It's impossible to even know that this world has a meaning that transcends it. Sounds really familiar to what we've been talking about in Ecclesiastes, right? Thus, life is absurd because the world is unresponsive to the human need for meaning, the need to have a purpose to his life, and to perceive coherence, unity, and rational order in the world. In other words, I know what man wants, which is meaning, and I know what the world offers him, which is meaninglessness. It is absurd to be offered the exact opposite of what we need or want. According to Camus, in recognizing that life is absurd, the consequence should neither be hope, especially hope in God, nor suicide. What should it then be? What is the point of living? Living is keeping the absurd alive. Keeping it alive is, above all, contemplating it. In keeping the absurd alive by contemplating it, thus I draw from the absurd three consequences which are my revolt, my freedom, and my passion. By the mere activity of consciousness, I transform into a rule of life what was an invitation to death, and I refuse suicide. This is a profound statement with far-reaching implications. What does it mean? This rule of life is refusing suicide while rejecting divine transcendence, involves revolt, freedom, and passion. It is a revolt because it refuses the invitation to death, even though this means having to constantly face the conflict between what we need and what we get, meaning versus meaninglessness. And yet living a meaningless life spells freedom because to the extent to which we imagined a purpose to our life, often given by God, we adapted ourselves to the demands of a purpose and became a slave. But what does life mean in such a universe? Nothing else for the moment but indifference to the future and a desire to use up everything that is given. That is, live in the present moment to the fullest measure with passion, though it is tantamount to substituting the quantity of experiences for the quality. Camus' reflection on suicide and the absurdity of life led him to conclude it was previously a question of finding out whether or not life had to have a meaning to be lived. It now becomes clear, on the contrary, that it will be lived all the better if it has no meaning. In fact, he says the revolt, which is refusing suicide and keeping the absurd alive, is what gives life its value. Hence, he considers such an absurd life as having value and thus worth living. End of quote. Whew. All right, let's breathe for a second because I realized that was a super long quote and it was really deep. There was a lot to it. I will put that up on the website as well. It kind of helps to be able to read it actually and maybe reread it a couple times so you get the full nuance of what he's saying there. And I will say too, Camus is a super controversial philosopher. I don't think he liked the term philosopher for himself, if I remember correctly, but yeah, he's definitely become a very prominent one. And there's a lot of disagreement over the value of some of what he says here. So it's okay if you don't fully agree with what was just said there. That's totally okay. But I do think that it's worth considering. Suicide is a really difficult topic. And as someone who has struggled with depression and even been to the point of being suicidal before, you do kind of have to ask yourself these questions of what is actually the purpose of life? Why am I continuing this? Does the good actually outweigh the bad? And I think part of the reason that people can end up in a suicidal state is because they don't see the good that is in life. Now, I'm not trying to stereotype here. Obviously, my experience does not count for everybody, and everyone's circumstance is different. But, you don't usually feel suicidal when you're happy and enjoying life. It's usually when you are focused on something negative or you're having a hard time seeing any good in life. So I think what Qoheleth is getting at here is that so many people live in the middle of this. So, sometimes you have those people who are just constantly happy all the time. They have this very optimistic personality. Nothing can get them down. It's kind of like, was it Emmett from the Lego movie, right? Where everything is awesome. And I'm sorry if I got that stuck in your head now for the rest of the day. But, you get a few people sometimes who have that personality. And then you get people who are Eeyores on the opposite end of the spectrum. Most people, though, live somewhere in the middle. And I think Qoheleth is trying to say that there's something about the suicidal person that is actually more realistic, more true to life than the person who goes about his entire life and never consider suicide. Because it's not until you have reached the point where the reality of your own life and how much longer it continues is in your own hands that you start to ponder the actual worth of living. And that's something that the average person doesn't necessarily think about. Not everybody goes through their life thinking about suicide or feeling suicidal. I'd say probably the majority of people either never feel that way or maybe only experience it once in their life. The person who is at that point has to look at, is there anything worth staying here for? Whereas the average person goes through a good life and can go through that entire good life not realizing how good it is. So at least being at this point forces you to look for something worth staying around for. And so I think Qoheleth is forcing us to stare down the barrel of a metaphorical 45 here and say, what is worth living for in my life? You might be listening to this right now and you have never been a person who has struggled with depression, you have never considered suicide. That's great. I think Qoheleth is trying to say, what if you did? Now, not to get you to actually kill yourself. That's not what Qoheleth is saying here. He doesn't actually go to the point that he says you should kill yourself. And I don't think that at all either. I think that there is always something worth living for. I think that there is always hope that can be found. Sometimes it's harder to find than others. Sometimes it's harder to feel than others. But I just want to put this up here and say that if this is something you have struggled with, there is hope, there is help, and I will, since we've talked about it so much right now, I will include some resources for suicide awareness, prevention, and help on the notes for this episode as well. Because as someone who has been there, I believe it's important that we raise awareness of this and just tell people, speak into the void, that you're not alone, that there's hope, that there's help, and that life can get better, and does. Because someone out there probably needs to hear that. So if that is something you struggle with, please realize I am not saying in this that you should put yourself back in that frame of mind. Not at all. But I think Qoheleth is speaking to people who have never considered it at all, where their brains and bodies don't bring it up to them at times that they don't want. I think he's challenging the average person who has never considered suicide to say, what if you actually put yourself metaphorically in that place and said, what is the reason I'm staying here? Why is life worth living? Because then you create this list of the little joys that you have in life, the little pleasures that are worth sticking around for, the sunset that you would like to see again, the place that you would like to visit before you die, the friends that you need to see again, the relationships that you need to reconcile, the movie that hasn't come out for another 3 months and you want to see. Whatever it is, you create this whole list. And that then helps you as someone who doesn't experience these suicidal feelings to then go about your normal daily life appreciating those little things again. Because it's only once you get confronted with the reality of death that you can truly enjoy life. This is, I'll give you a little spoiler for next week here, but he says in chapter 7 that it's better to be in a house of mourning than a house of feasting. Put that into modern parlance, he's saying it's better to go to a funeral than a party. And that sounds really weird, and we'll talk about more next week, but I think these thoughts are all combined. Ecclesiastes isn't chronological, it's not linear, it doesn't just go in a straight line. It works more in circles. You remember if you had to learn cursive in school when you had to just draw those slightly overlapping circles that were supposed to be super tight and just go one right after the other? That's the way Ecclesiastes reads, is just in these concentric circles going around and overlapping each other slightly. So these themes keep reappearing, and it's going to happen again in the next chapter as well. So I think this is what he's trying to get us to think about, is like, what if you considered death? Could it make you appreciate life more? Shapiro again comes in and says, you come into the world to manifest joy, not to accumulate wealth, not to indulge in pleasure. If you fail to manifest joy, no matter how long you live your life, you live it as if you are stillborn. Okay, we're going to transition in just a second here, but I just want to give one more note to circle back around. There's it's a little bit of a trite phrase, but I think it applies here, that the Bible is meant to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comforted. And I think that's very much what is happening here. The Bible does not equally speak into every life in exactly the same way. Every person is at a different stage of life and needs something different at this time. So if you're the sort of person, maybe like me, where you deal with depression and you have a little bit more of a negative outlook on life, these verses that we've talked about here, these are not the ones that you should be focusing on. These are the ones that you have already lived. And then we get more into the application that he has of this mindset. And I think Qoheleth does still have a very positive outlook on life. It's just a realistic one. That's what we should be focusing on. But if you're the sort of person who has just glided through life and never actually taken stock of what you have, and who misses out on all the good things because you're just constantly trying to get to the next thing, then this is the sort of verse that is meant for you and that you should be taking more time to think about. If you feel afflicted, the Bible is here to comfort you, and it is not meant to afflict you further. So if you read something and it's distressing you more, that's a good way to know that that's not the passage for you right now, or maybe that's not the interpretation for you right now. There are other ways of looking at the text. But if you take it and you're just feeling a little uncomfortable because you realize it's pressing some buttons that are a little sensitive for you right now because you've been avoiding them, then maybe that is what you need right now, and it's speaking into your life. So realize that the Bible should never be used to make someone's life more miserable, and it should not be used to encourage the status quo, particularly when that leads to abuse or a lack of, can I say, even just proper enjoyment of life, like we have here in this passage. So if you find these verses, something like this, and you find that it's causing more anxiety for you, it's totally okay to skip that right now. Can I say that again? Because I realize that you probably don't hear that from too many pastors and preachers. And, I'm here as a Bible scholar talking to you on this podcast. I want you to be able to hear from someone who has dedicated his life to studying the Bible that it is okay to skip certain parts if they are causing more harm than good for you right now. The Bible should never be used to harm. It is not intended to harm. Now, sometimes people use it to harm. Sometimes passages harm us because of things that have happened in our own lives, sometimes even by no fault of our own. It's just a trauma trigger. And that's why we give those little content warnings, because we realize not every passage is meant for every person at every time. The Bible is meant to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comforted. Something in the Bible as a whole for every person, but that doesn't mean that every part of the Bible is for every person at every time. There's always another passage you can flip to, and there's always another interpretation you can look at as well that might be a little more healing for where you are right now. And that's totally okay. Verse 9 is a little difficult to understand, where he says, "Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of desire. This is hevel and chasing of wind, or vexation of spirit." There's basically two different ways that you can understand it, and the World Biblical Commentary summarizes them well. The first option is a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. The second option is it's better to be alive than dead. So with the first option, better the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the desire. So that's the bird in the hand is worth more than two in the bush idea. What you have right in front of you is better than what you desire, because even if you desire something good, you're only desiring it because you don't have it. So what you have is inherently better than what you want because you actually have it. Or the other option, better to be alive than dead. Well, the sight of the eyes you can see with your eyes, but in death there is only desire. There is no consumption. There is no possession. Only want, only lack, only nothingness. Either one of those could potentially work. I kind of lean more into the first option here, especially since he has just questioned the value of just life on the table as it is just a couple verses ago. But you could read this as a counter to that, because he very much brings these different balanced perspectives. And remember chapter 3, where he says there's a time to do this and a time to do that, and they're opposites. So he has this very nuanced perspective where he's saying there is a time for everything in life. I also like how Brown in the interpretation commentary said, it's better to see good than to devour good. In many ways, that's a commentary on our modern American life. There is so much in the world that we saw as good and then devoured for our own purposes. And even just in nature around us, we see the beauty of the world around us, and we have devoured those resources to create our machines that move us forward into the future. And it's okay to use the resources that are at hand, but when you devour it, when you consume it, it no longer has beauty. And I think about the science experiments you have in high school where you have to dissect, say, a butterfly. Butterfly is beautiful to look at, but the minute you start to dissect it in order to understand it scientifically, it's no longer beautiful. You have killed that innocent, beautiful thing in order to understand how it works. In order to get under the hood of the machine, you have to see all of the moving parts, and it kind of removes just some of the magic. Once you lift the hood of a car, you see all of the nuts and bolts and everything, and it doesn't look as sleek as the outside of the car. So in many ways, you could see it the way that Brown does here, where it's better to just enjoy beauty than it is to consume beauty. That's a very thought-provoking statement. Now, these last 3 verses that we have here in the chapter are very difficult to translate and pretty difficult to understand as well. Let's give them a quick read. That which has been is named already, and it is known that it is man. Neither may he contend with him who is mightier than he. Seeing there be many things that increase Hevel, what is man the better? For who knows what is good for a human in this life? All the days of his vain life which he spends as a shadow, for who can tell a man what will be after him under the sun? Now, just reading that, you probably could tell how confusing some of that is. Before we get into its meaning, I want to point out what A.G. Wright has noted in these verses. He discerned a pattern here where these 3 verses work as the pivot of the entire book. It's really interesting. He says that the first 111 verses, which is chapter 1 verse 1 through chapter 6 verse 9, are the sum of 3 times 37. 3 times 37 is 111. You say, what the heck does that mean? Well, 37 is the numerical equivalent of the Hebrew word hevel, which we often have as vanity. Now, this gets a little bit into numerology here, which I realize can be a little weird. We talked about this back when we did, I think it was the episode in Genesis 4, talking about the genealogy there, but each Hebrew letter can be assigned a numerical equivalent. So basically in English, if we did, it would be A equals 1, B equals 2, C equals 3, so forth and so on. You can do that with the Hebrew alphabet, and in fact it was done because earlier Hebrew didn't have characters for numbers, so they use the letters also for the numbers. Now, if you start getting into numerology online, you're going to get into some really wacky stuff really fast. However, there are times that the biblical writers used it, and I like it when it just shows off the beauty of the text. I don't like it when it tries to make theological arguments that I don't think have a place there. So this is an example of where I think it's actually possible that this was intentional and done just as a literary flourish, because man, this is a work of art. So he's saying that there are 111 verses up until this point, which is the sum of 3 times 37, 37 being the numerical equivalent of the word hevel. This signal, this is the World Biblical Commentary right now, this signal was already given in the threefold repetition of Hevel in the inclusions, chapter 1 verse 2 and chapter 12 verse 8. So he's saying that Hevel shows up 3 times there. Therefore, one may regard 6:10 as the beginning of a new section, the second half of the book. Since chapter 7 verse 1 clearly begins a series of sayings, chapter 6 verses 10 through 12 should be considered the introduction to the second half. So we are in the very middle of the book at this point, And this is the pivot point before we get into some Proverbs-like statements that we'll have next week in chapter 7. Now let's get into the meaning of these 3 verses here, because it's pretty complicated. Brown, in the interpretation commentary, took these verses as a deterministic statement, and one that stands in opposition to other voices in the Bible that believe words have power. And what he means is, if you read throughout the Bible, you get the idea that our words have significant meaning, and sometimes even power. Words are like weapons, they wound sometimes, right? But Brown thinks that verse 10 is suggesting that there's essentially a timeline of history that has already been established. This is very much the deterministic, God is sovereign mindset. This is the idea of like a time travel movie where you go back in time to stop something from happening, but no matter what you do, the bad thing still happens. I enjoy those movies, but I'm not sure I agree with the premise. I personally believe that time is fluid and can change based on our decisions. Now, this is another topic for another day, but what you believe about God and his sovereignty and whether or not he's all powerful and how he controls humanity, whether you're a Calvinist, an Arminianist, something in between, that all has bearing on this conversation, because some people have this idea that we are all predestined to live life the way that happened. Other people think we have the free will to make our own decisions, and if I choose to do A, life is going to happen this way. If I choose to do B, it's going to happen a different way. And there are all kinds of debates over this. Now, personally, I kind of have what I would consider to be like a position in between that. It's kind of similar to something called Molinism, where I think that it's not so much that God has predetermined events, but that rather he just knows all possible events. Very similar to the idea of Doctor Strange in Infinity War, where he sees the 14 million, was it, I think 605 possible futures or something like that. And how many did we win in? One, right? Great scene. I think it's kind of similar to that with God, is where he is able to see every possible future. He is able to play out, if Colin does A, this is going to happen. If he does B, this is going to happen. If he does C, this is going to happen. So in that sense, he knows the future because he knows every possible future. But that does not mean that he has determined, I am going to do A. It means that he knows all options A through Z I can do, and whichever one I end up doing, he knows what is going to happen from that choice forward. So I think I take that view on it. So I would actually differ with Qoheleth here if you take the idea that he is speaking of a deterministic timeline, like Brown says. I think you can take this in other ways. I don't think you have to see Qoheleth as someone who has this deterministic idea that God has planned out exactly what's going to happen. But I do honestly see how some people can get to that point, and it's a fair position to take. It's quite possible that Qoheleth did actually see the world that way. I definitely see some connections to Job here, because God took Job back to creation during his time of questioning at the end of the book. And here Qoheleth speaks of naming. That which has been is named already. Naming is a key part of creation, where God names the different aspects of creation, then eventually Adam, and then Adam names the different animals. And furthermore, the word for man here in this verse, the word for humanity, is Adam in Hebrew. So I think there are connections here, both to Job and then also all the way back to creation. Now, part of the nuance of this is that we don't know exactly what he is saying has been named and what it means for it to be named. Does that mean it has been determined? Does that mean it has been given a purpose? You absolutely have the idea of naming in the ancient Near East meaning to give something a purpose. So that's also a possibility. Is he just saying that everything that is in life has a purpose? And then he says it's known that it is human. So is he saying that humanity has a purpose? Is he saying that God has already determined the whole timeline for all of humanity as a whole? Like, he doesn't necessarily control us individually, but he's controlling the main outcomes of humanity. I know a pastor who took this view and they compared it to being on a cruise ship. Like, when you're on the cruise ship, you have the freedom to do whatever you want on the ship, but you're still going to get to the destination because that's where the ship's captain is taking you. So is it that idea? Or is it the idea that God has controlled the outcome, named the outcome, determined the outcome for every individual? There are just so many different ways that you can take it. I would translate it in a more literalistic way like this. What will happen? It has already been given a name or a purpose, and man himself knew that it is he. But he can't comprehend enough to plead his case with the one who's more powerful than him. So I think here Qoheleth circles back to that earlier idea that God has just barely placed an understanding of purpose just ever so slightly out of our reach, and we are constantly grasping for something beyond ourselves when it's actually us ourselves. It says, what will happen? Well, it's already been given a purpose. Like, there is a purpose to life, even if we can't discern it. But what is it? Well, it's us. That is the literal rendering of this. Man himself knew that it is he. Humanity itself knew that it is the purpose. It is the name. But he can't comprehend it enough in order to plead his case with the one who's more powerful than him. All this stuff that Qoheleth has been calling out and saying, this is an evil, this is an injustice, this isn't the way it's supposed to be, this is a glitch in the matrix. We don't have the capability of somehow tearing a rend in the fabric of existence to step into the supernatural realm and plead our case with God. And this is why I think, again, there's a connection here to Job, because that is the thought experiment of Job. What if you could actually have an audience with God? What if you could actually call God to account for the things that have happened? What would happen in that case? So I think there's definitely a connection there. And the World Biblical Commentary definitely catches onto some of that ambiguity as well by their translation, where he says, what has existed has a name, and we know it. It is Adam, and he cannot contend with the one who is mightier than he is. Verse 11 just continues to build the tension by asking, if there are all of these things that we have talked about so far in this first half of the book that increase Hevel, that just make life more of a baffling enigma, what are we better for it? What is the benefit of this life? Shapiro says, how do you respond to impermanence and insecurity? Do you embrace Hevel or do you hide from it? Most people hide, and most of them hide in busyness, rushing here and there, doing this and that, grasping all they can and racing back for more. What they grasped fades like dew. Is this all there is to you? Are you more than craving and clinging, grasping and hoarding? What a thought-provoking question for us to ask ourselves. Sometimes we live less of a life than we're intended to because we're trying to find more of a life than what we're intended to, and we miss out on the more that we already have right now. I really like a quote that Shapiro brought in from the Bhagavad Gita that says, the saint is awake when the world sleeps, and he ignores that for which the world lives. I definitely see a resonance there with what Qoheleth has said. And in verse 12, he closes out this transition point by saying, who actually knows what is good for a human in this life? All the days of his vain life. And that's that word Hevel again. All the days of his baffling life, which he spends like a shadow. What an image. Our life is like a shadow. It's here one moment, gone the next. You can't catch it. There's no substance to it. What is it there for? Who can tell a person what will be after him under the sun? Now, that does not necessarily mean what comes in the next life. He's not necessarily asking what is going to happen in eternity. I think it's more so saying what is going to happen next in life when we're gone, when we're off the scene and life stops being about us, at least in the way that we thought it was. What is going to happen? What's going to happen with the next generation? I thought Brown had a really good playful note on the whole idea of naming from a couple verses ago. He says, the images of dust and frailty, inextricably linked to the image of humanity, serves to underscore humanity's finitude. Destined by God, humanity is bound to limitation. It cannot request a name change. End of quote. Returning now full circle to the way we began with Shapiro's observations. He said, fantasies about death are at the heart of all religious systems. They are the way you avoid the absolute truth of Hevel. You say to yourself, Perhaps it's true that this world is marked by impermanence, but the next is surely eternal. But can you really know this? Of course not. And because you can't know, doubt creeps in and robs you of even this false security. Qoheleth urges you to live with not knowing. His is the wisdom of insecurity. There is little you can know in this world, and nothing you can know of any world to come. Take refuge in what can be known, and leave the rest alone. What can be known? That all life is emptying, that to live well in an emptying world means to eat simply, drink moderately, work constructively, and befriend lovingly. This chapter has pushed us to reject the never-ending struggle for more and to rest in the enjoyment of what we currently have. That's kind of the definition of contentment. It's not something that we have to search after. It's just enjoying the things that we have right in front of us right now. I think Qoheleth's message to us in this chapter is to seek value over vanity, if I can use the word that is usually translated for hevel. Seek the value in life over the hevel of getting more. Don't pursue the things that won't matter once you're dead. Focus on the friends, family, and activities that you enjoy now. You're not guaranteed a retirement period to enjoy them. So live with purpose, not possessiveness. More really deep stuff from our favorite philosopher, Qoheleth. Man, it's so incredible to me that these texts are so ancient and yet so relevant. And I realize some of this stuff is difficult to get through, and as I've said before and will probably say again during this series, listen to yourself and take the time that you need to get through this. You do not have to listen to these podcasts all in one sitting. Heck, you don't even have to listen to the podcast. If it is going to distress you further, some of the stuff he talks about, it's okay to skip. I am not offended. I want you to take care of yourself. And I realize that some of these topics can be a little distressing to focus on for so long. And that's why we've interspersed some other stuff with this so we get an occasional break in it, because even though I don't think that Qoheleth is a pessimist or just down in the dumps, I realize that these are really hard topics. And that's a muscle that you have to exercise to be able to think through that without spiraling. And so much of what we hear in churches isn't this reality. It's either just feel-good fluff or it's feel-bad accusations in preaching. We don't get a lot of actually thoughtful contemplation about the realistic state of life. So I realize that it's going to be different from what you've often heard. And that's a good thing, because the Bible is different from what many of us have heard. So hope you've enjoyed this. Any questions, thoughts you have on this, feel free to send them in. You can comment on our socials. You can send in thoughts on the website. You can respond to both YouTube and Spotify right there in the episodes. We love hearing from you. Love to hear your thoughts on it so far. Next week, we are getting into Chapter 7, and boy, oh boy, is that going to be a fun chapter. I am really excited about this. I'm still doing some study for it right now. The end of the chapter has one of the most easy to misinterpret passages when it comes to women in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament. I know there's a lot in Paul that gets used and abused and argued over when it comes to women, but the end of chapter 7 is one of the most misogynistic texts in the entirety of the Tanakh in the way that it gets taken often. But oh man, I can't wait to share with you what I have found for this study, because there are some crazy things that we just don't realize reading it in English that can really change the meaning there. So really looking forward to that study. And until then, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.